So what is silo mentality? Can you chat it?
Us versus them. Left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing, protecting my turf. Inability to work cross-functionally, limited scope, defending your own territory, defending your function, lack of collaboration, inability to see the larger picture, taking too narrow a view.
And Janet, you remember? Janet, you remember where our previous president of the university, what did she say? She said, Harvard needs to stop being islands, right? Remember that? What was that? I forget.
Well, it was the genesis of One Harvard.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Inward focus versus outward focus, protecting fiefdoms and jobs.
Absolutely. So you look at that, exactly right. Us versus them, play the game, empire building, all the stuff that it happens, but this is normal. I just want to clarify, this is not abnormal behavior, right? Now, I wrote an article in HBR many years ago called Silo Busting, and I have to confess, I really made a big blunder. And the blunder was I got the title wrong. Silo busting implies you can get rid of silos. You need silos. Silos create accountability, focus. The article, I should have called it silo bridging. And just to kind of toot our own horn over here, if I may, if you look at today's event, we have here external relations, which is Janet's organization, and exec ed, which is our delivery organization, collaborating together. That's silo bridging, right? Now, the question is, how do we ensure that happens more? Because these silos then block change. So we have inertia in our strategy, we have inertia in our organization, and these are normal. I'm not saying anyone is bad. There's no ill intention here. And then the biggest one is cultural inertia. And I'm going to show Lou Gerstner talking about culture and how it blocks, derails change, and what he learned at IBM.
What I discovered at IBM is that underneath all of the processes of execution, if you're really going to transform an enterprise, you've got to understand culture. You really have to understand the culture of your institution. And you know what? It took me to age 55 to figure that out. When I always viewed culture as sort of one of those things you talked about, sort of like advertising, marketing, production. It was one of the things one of the tools that a manager had at his or her disposal when you think about an enterprise. The thing that I have learned at IBM is that culture is everything. If you're going to have a high performance enterprise, an institution that wins, that continually wins in the marketplace, you've got to have an environment that's supportive of the execution that you need to carry out the strategy that you've defined. And so in this case that you've all read, the main reason that the prior management couldn't move IBM was that the institution couldn't move. It wasn't a case of not having a strategy. It wasn't a case of being told to execute. It was a case that the behavior and the systems and the values in the institution had been created for another age, another time, another strategy. And that until we got to the issues of culture and values and behavior, we never, ever would have changed IBM.
So let me ask you a question. Everyone talks about culture. Everyone talks about culture, but people don't want to spend time on culture. Why is that? Why is that? My observation is people talk a lot about culture, but when it comes time to having a culture conversation or a meeting saying, let's have a culture strategy task force, it's like, oh my God, it puts everyone to sleep. Why is there a systematic underinvestment in culture, if you will, culture work? What do you think?
It's political. People have a hard time changing. It's too touchy-feely. You need consensus, requires self-examination. People take it for granted. The definition of culture varies. It's not measurable. People issues. This difficulty to measure is one comment that's coming through. It's too
And Janet,
soft.
the question for everybody is, it's interesting, isn't it, that everyone says it's really important, it's critical for success and viability, and it can be the biggest derailer of strategy, the old Drucker quote about culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch or whatever meal you want to put it at.
Right.
But we still don't want to spend time on it. And we make excuses, right? So what are the excuses for it, right? We say it's, what is it? You said what? It's hard to
There's
measure.
no KPI. It's hard to measure. It's different definitions for people. It's a psychology, and we're not trained to actually deal with that.
Yeah. And then we have a time horizon issue. I want immediate, I want action. I want now, not like 5 years from now or 3 years from now. And so I think it's important to understand, and I would tell you that, culture is such a critical element of organizations that we don't spend enough time on. So first of all, I want to just clarify to you. Thanks, Janet. Culture is invisible rules, right? It's invisible. These are the things that what we say, culture is how people operate when no one is watching. What are they really doing? What's the culture of the place? And every organization has a culture. Some have strong cultures, some have weak cultures, but they all have cultures. And culture does what to us? Culture creates a bias for inaction. It creates a bias for habit, and a bias for playing defense and protect what we have. So if we are not willing to take on our culture, culture will hold us back. And culture is the last wagon on the train, by the way. It's the last one to want to move.
So Rajay, right? Here's an interesting thing though. One comment, typically the people in charge or the leaders are those who thrived in the old culture.
Interesting. So they have an vested interest to want to protect.
Or perhaps an inability actually to change the culture.
Yeah. So when you ask incumbent, you bring your leadership team together and say, hey, folks, we need to change our culture. What is the typical response going to be?
We don't need to. It's worked. Yeah, it's worked in the past.
Yeah. So very good observation. Any questions come up, Janet, that I should be thinking about? I want to just take a pause here.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there are a lot of questions, and let me try to summarize this. It's a question of, again, going to the 9%, and it has to do with difference between established companies or smaller companies, right? Where there's some assumption, is it more difficult for larger companies and established companies to change because they, the assumption being they can't pivot? Or what's interesting is, do you find that they perhaps are able to change because they've made investments, whether it's in R&D or technology or products? They have a platform essentially that they can exploit actually to make the change. So this question of what are you seeing in that 9% of trends between large organizations and small organizations?
That's a great question. So let me stretch myself a bit to answer that. I don't have the data exactly, but I've been studying small companies over the last many years as well. So let me give it a shot. First of all, I was just trying to establish to you why 91%. Now, I hope you see the 91% are not bad people. They are locked in by strategic inertia, organizational inertia, by cultural inertia. Now you'll say to me, what about small companies can grow and be agile? So I wrote an article last year in the Harvard Business Review called The Soul of a Startup. And it was actually based entirely on studies of startup companies. Startup meaning I was looking at the growth stage, so beyond the product market fit. And it was remarkable for me to see how many small enterprises, 50 employees to 200 employees, get stuck. They don't know how to pivot. They are also locked into a strategy. They also have something to lose. They have a business, it's working. They've got customers. It may not grow fast, and they start to lock in, and suddenly things start to kind of lock into a way of doing things. And sometimes founders themselves don't want to change. So, or you look at early stage employees, and now the company is growing, and now they don't want to professionalize. They want to hold on to that old way of informal way of doing things. And so they can't take it to scale. So you start to see them. And then when you bring in the outsider, the professionals and the early employees get into a tug of war because they don't want to, there's a whole kind of like, what's our way of doing things? So you see kind of similar inertial patterns, even in small companies. So it's a great question.